Military conquest in pre-modern societies did not end at the battlefield. Victory reshaped populations, redistributed wealth, and redefined social hierarchies, often with profound consequences for women captured during campaigns. Historical records indicate that across imperial systems, from the courts of the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Persia to Mughal India, Abbasid Baghdad, and earlier Byzantine and Chinese dynasties, the incorporation of captive women into royal harems formed part of a broader political economy of power, diplomacy, and dynastic continuity. These institutions were not simply private domestic spaces, but complex administrative environments embedded within state structures. Contemporary accounts describe the capture of women as a regulated outcome of warfare, governed by legal traditions, economic incentives, and courtly expectations. In many Islamic polities, juristic writings distinguished between free women and those classified as war captives, outlining conditions of enslavement, conversion, and integration into elite households. Surviving legal manuals suggest that while the initial capture was violent and coercive, subsequent treatment within royal harems followed codified norms intended to regulate lineage, inheritance, and court protocol. These frameworks were neither uniform nor consistently humane, but they demonstrate that harems operated within structured legal and bureaucratic boundaries rather than purely arbitrary domination. Chroniclers noted that the movement of captives from frontier zones to imperial capitals was itself an organized process. Administrative documents from the Ottoman Imperial Center reveal that captives were often registered, evaluated for health and skills, and distributed according to rank. Women considered suitable for the imperial palace were transferred through networks managed by court officials, eunuchs, and intermediaries. The journey from battlefield to palace could span months, involving transit markets, provincial households, and training facilities where language acquisition, religious instruction, and court etiquette were emphasized. Surviving correspondence indicates that this period functioned as both social dislocation and preparation for assimilation into a hierarchical domestic order. The royal harem was less a singular room of seclusion than an institutional complex governed by rigid hierarchy. Legal codes of the period reveal layered distinctions among concubines, legal wives, servants, tutors, and administrators. At the apex stood the mother of the ruler or senior consort, whose authority extended into court politics and succession management. Historical records suggest that women brought into the harem entered at its lowest levels, often as attendants or trainees, with advancement contingent upon favor, skill, fertility, and political circumstance. This stratification created both competition and opportunity, shaping daily life in ways that varied dramatically between individuals. Daily conditions within harems were structured by routine, surveillance, and education. Surviving architectural layouts indicate that movement was carefully regulated, with spatial divisions reinforcing rank and restricting unauthorized interaction. Contemporary observers described schedules centered on instruction, religious practice, textile production, music, and preparation for ceremonial duties. While some narratives portray the harem as a site of indulgence, administrative inventories and expenditure records suggest a more disciplined environment, oriented toward maintaining decorum, preparing potential consorts, and ensuring the orderly upbringing of royal offspring. Mechanisms of control extended beyond physical confinement. Eunuch officials, frequently recruited from different regions and social backgrounds, acted as intermediaries between the harem and the outer court. Chroniclers noted that their roles encompassed security, communication management, and enforcement of protocol. Surviving payroll registers indicate that these officials held significant institutional authority, often surpassing that of lower-ranking male courtiers. Their presence reflects a deliberate strategy to regulate access, preserve dynastic legitimacy, and minimize factional interference in succession politics. The possibility of sexual relations between rulers and captive women was inseparable from dynastic considerations. Historical records indicate that concubinage functioned as a recognized pathway to motherhood within imperial households, sometimes carrying political implications equal to or exceeding those of formal marriage. In the Ottoman context, contemporary accounts describe how the birth of a son could elevate a concubine's status dramatically, granting her resources, apartments, and influence within the palace hierarchy. Yet surviving documents also suggest that this elevation intensified scrutiny, as maternal rank became intertwined with succession struggles and factional alliances. Not all women experienced upward mobility. Estate inventories and mortality records reveal that many remained in subordinate positions, performing labor necessary to sustain the palace economy. Textile workshops, kitchens, educational spaces, and childcare responsibilities depended heavily on the work of women who never entered the ruler's personal orbit. Their experiences are less visible in narrative chronicles, but emerge indirectly through financial accounts, provisioning logs, and disciplinary records. These sources suggest a life defined by routine service, limited autonomy, and dependence on institutional structures for survival. Religious conversion frequently accompanied integration into royal harems, though its nature varied across empires and periods. Juristic writings indicate that conversion could alter legal status, inheritance rights, and eligibility for certain forms of advancement. Surviving baptismal and conversion registers from border regions imply that identity transformation was both a personal and administrative process, facilitating assimilation while reinforcing imperial cultural frameworks. However, chroniclers also noted the persistence of linguistic and cultural diversity within harems, reflecting the geographic breadth of imperial expansion. Diplomatic dimensions further complicate the narrative. Historical records indicate that not all women entered harems through violent capture. Some arrived as part of tribute exchanges, diplomatic marriages, or negotiated settlements following conflict. In these cases, the boundary between captive and political participant blurred. Contemporary correspondence from European and Central Asian courts suggests that elite women could serve as conduits of cultural exchange, influencing fashion, artistic patronage, and even informal diplomacy. These examples do not negate the coercive foundations of conquest, but illustrate the multiplicity of roles women could occupy within imperial domestic structures. Motherhood represented one of the most consequential transitions within harem life. Surviving court regulations indicate that the upbringing of royal children was governed by elaborate protocols designed to balance maternal attachment with political caution. Tutors, wet nurses, and administrators often mediated contact between mothers and sons, reflecting concerns about factional influence and succession stability. Chroniclers noted that the eventual assignment of princes to provincial governorships frequently resulted in the relocation of their mothers, extending the reach of harem politics into regional administration. These movements demonstrate how women originally brought as captives could become embedded within the governance networks of empire. The eventual fate of women who did not bear royal children varied widely. Manumission practices, documented in legal registers, allowed some to leave palace service, often with stipends, property, or arranged marriages to officials. Surviving manumission deeds suggest that such transitions could provide a degree of social mobility, enabling former captives to establish households integrated into urban society. Yet other records indicate that aging, illness, or political shifts could result in marginalization, reduced resources, or transfer to lesser households. The absence of uniform outcomes reflects the contingent nature of status within hierarchical court environments. Long-term psychological experiences remain difficult to reconstruct, yet indirect evidence offers partial insight. Architectural modifications, private endowments, and charitable foundations established by former concubines suggest attempts to negotiate identity, piety, and legacy within constrained circumstances. Chroniclers occasionally referenced acts of patronage, including mosque construction, educational funding, and charitable distributions, indicating that some women leveraged their positions to shape urban and religious landscapes. These activities reveal the interplay between personal agency and structural limitation within imperial domestic systems. Comparative perspectives highlight both common patterns and regional distinctions. Byzantine and Chinese court records describe parallel institutions where captured or tribute women entered palace households governed by strict hierarchy and ceremonial discipline. Surviving bureaucratic manuals from the Ming and Qing courts indicate extensive training regimes, ranking systems, and evaluation procedures that echo practices documented elsewhere. These similarities suggest that the integration of captive women into royal domestic structures was not an anomaly, but part of broader imperial strategies linking conquest, reproduction, and governance. Over time, shifting military technologies, diplomatic norms, and legal reforms altered the prevalence and function of such practices. 19th-century reform movements, influenced by changing economic conditions and external political pressures, introduced new legal frameworks regulating slavery, concubinage, and palace organization. Archival decrees from the late Ottoman and Qajar periods indicate gradual restrictions on slave acquisition and evolving expectations regarding household composition. These developments did not immediately dismantle entrenched systems, but contributed to their transformation and eventual decline. The historical trajectory of women taken into royal harems after military conquest reflects a convergence of coercion, adaptation, and institutional complexity. Surviving documents suggest that their experiences cannot be reduced to a single narrative of victimhood or empowerment. Instead, they reveal a spectrum shaped by hierarchy, fertility, political circumstance, and personal resilience. The harem functions simultaneously as a mechanism of control, a site of cultural assimilation, and a locus of dynastic strategy, embedding the lives of captured women within the broader architecture of imperial rule. Surviving administrative records indicate that life within royal harems was deeply influenced by the rhythms of court politics and the uncertainties of imperial succession. The position of a ruler's consorts and attendants could shift rapidly in response to births, deaths, factional rivalries, and changes in leadership. Chroniclers noted that the death of a ruler often triggered significant reorganization within the harem, as new hierarchies emerged and the influence of individual women either expanded or diminished. In some imperial systems, the accession of a new ruler resulted in the formal retirement, relocation, or political isolation of women associated with the previous reign, reflecting concerns about loyalty and stability. The Ottoman imperial experience offers particularly detailed insight into these dynamics due to the survival of palace registers and diplomatic observations. Historical records indicate that the Old Palace in Istanbul frequently housed women from earlier reigns, including former consorts and attendants whose political relevance had diminished. This relocation was not merely residential but administrative, creating a controlled environment where individuals retained status and stipends while remaining removed from active court politics. Contemporary accounts describe this transition as a mixture of security and confinement, where material needs were met but social mobility became limited. Power within the harem was often exercised through indirect channels rather than overt authority. Surviving correspondence suggests that senior women maintained networks of patronage involving eunuchs, tutors, and external court officials. These relationships facilitated the exchange of information, the distribution of gifts, and the negotiation of appointments. Chroniclers noted that influence frequently depended on one's ability to navigate these networks discreetly, particularly in matters concerning the education and advancement of royal sons. The political significance of motherhood meant that even women who entered the harem as captives could eventually participate in shaping imperial governance through their children's futures. Education played a central role in this transformation. Palace curricula documented in court manuals indicate that women were instructed not only in religious practice and etiquette, but also in literacy, music, and household administration. Surviving lesson inventories suggest that training prepared selected individuals for responsibilities that extended beyond companionship, including the supervision of younger attendants and the management of charitable foundations. These educational structures reinforced hierarchy while simultaneously enabling certain forms of agency, particularly for women who demonstrated aptitude in administration or artistic patronage. The economic dimensions of harem life reveal another layer of complexity. Financial registers indicate that women received stipends proportional to rank, supplemented by gifts from the ruler and revenues from endowments. These resources could be substantial, allowing senior figures to sponsor architectural projects, support artisans, and maintain private households within palace grounds. Chroniclers noted that economic independence, even when limited, provided a measure of security and the ability to cultivate alliances. However, access to wealth remained closely tied to favor and political relevance, leaving lower-ranking women with restricted financial autonomy. Legal status continued to shape long-term prospects. Surviving manumission records suggest that many women were formally freed after years of service, particularly if they had borne children or achieved seniority. Legal codes of the period reveal that manumission did not sever ties with the palace entirely. Instead, it often transformed relationships into patronage bonds. Former concubines might marry officials, retain stipends, or reside in properties funded by royal endowments. These arrangements allowed imperial households to extend influence into urban society while providing a controlled pathway for integration of former captives. Marriage following manumission represented both opportunity and constraint. Contemporary marriage contracts indicate that former harem residents were often paired with military officers, bureaucrats, or court affiliates whose loyalty was valued by the ruling establishment. This practice reinforced political cohesion by embedding individuals connected to the palace within administrative networks. At the same time, chroniclers noted that such marriages could limit personal autonomy, as expectations of discretion and continued loyalty to former patrons persisted. The legacy of harem affiliation shaped social identity long after physical departure from palace walls. Health and mortality formed an underexamined but significant aspect of harem experience. Palace medical records, though fragmentary, suggest the presence of dedicated physicians and midwives responsible for monitoring the well-being of residents. The concentration of large populations within enclosed spaces created vulnerabilities to disease outbreaks, prompting the implementation of hygiene regulations and quarantine measures. Contemporary observers occasionally referenced epidemics affecting palace populations, underscoring the shared risks that accompanied communal living regardless of rank. Maternal mortality, in particular, appears in burial registers as a recurring concern, reflecting the dangers associated with childbirth in pre-modern contexts. The emotional dimensions of separation from original families and homelands remain difficult to document directly, yet indirect evidence provides insight into coping mechanisms. Surviving poetry, musical compositions, and devotional practices attributed to palace women suggest efforts to construct new identities within unfamiliar environments. Chroniclers occasionally recorded instances of correspondence with relatives facilitated through diplomatic channels, though such contact was limited and often mediated. These fragments indicate that adaptation involved both assimilation into court culture and the preservation of personal memory, creating layered identities shaped by displacement and institutional belonging. Political crises frequently exposed the precariousness of harem life. Succession struggles, palace coups, and military revolts could transform protected domestic spaces into arenas of uncertainty. Historical records describe moments when rival factions sought to control access to potential heirs, placing women and children at the center of broader conflicts. The Ottoman period of the 17th century, sometimes characterized by historians as an era of intensified palace intrigue, offers examples where the authority of senior women expanded amid unstable leadership. Chroniclers noted that this influence, while significant, also attracted scrutiny and could provoke backlash from competing political actors. Exile and relocation represented another possible outcome following political upheaval. Surviving decrees indicate that women associated with unsuccessful claimants or disgraced officials were occasionally transferred to provincial residences or lesser palaces. These relocations were designed to neutralize perceived threats while preserving the appearance of dynastic dignity. Contemporary accounts suggest that conditions in such environments varied, with some individuals maintaining comfortable households while others experienced reduced resources and limited contact with the central court. The variability of these experiences reflects the broader interplay between personal circumstance and imperial priorities. Comparative evidence from Safavid and Mughal courts demonstrates similar patterns of integration, influence, and vulnerability. Administrative chronicles from Safavid Persia describe royal women participating in charitable endowments and acting as intermediaries in diplomatic exchanges, while Mughal records highlight the economic and architectural patronage of influential consorts. These examples indicate that the institutional framework of the harem could enable participation in cultural and political life even for individuals whose entry into the system originated in conquest. At the same time, chroniclers consistently emphasize the importance of discretion, as overt political visibility could generate resistance from male elites wary of informal influence. Interactions among women within the harem formed a social environment characterized by cooperation as well as competition. Surviving etiquette manuals reveal expectations of solidarity in religious observance and collective responsibilities in ceremonial preparation. Yet narrative sources also reference rivalries shaped by rank, maternal status, and proximity to power. These tensions were moderated by hierarchical supervision and the mediating role of senior figures responsible for maintaining order. The resulting social structure functioned as both support network and competitive hierarchy, shaping emotional and practical aspects of daily existence. Children born within the harem occupied a unique position linking domestic life to imperial governance. Educational records indicate that princes and princesses received structured instruction overseen by both male tutors and female supervisors. The presence of multiple maternal lineages within the palace contributed to complex interpersonal dynamics, as alliances formed around the prospects of individual heirs. Chroniclers noted that these relationships could influence court appointments, military campaigns, and diplomatic strategies, demonstrating how the experiences of women originally taken during military conquest extended into the highest levels of state decision-making. The aging process introduced further transitions. Surviving pension registers and endowment deeds suggest that elderly women often relied on stipends, charitable foundations, or support from children who had achieved political prominence. In some cases, senior figures established religious or philanthropic institutions intended to secure spiritual merit and social legacy. These acts of patronage provided a measure of autonomy and public recognition, allowing former captives to shape communal life beyond the confines of the palace. However, records also indicate instances of financial vulnerability when patronage networks weakened or political fortunes changed. By the 18th and 19th centuries, external pressures and internal reforms began altering the structures that had sustained royal harems for centuries. Diplomatic engagement with European powers, evolving economic conditions, and intellectual reform movements contributed to changing attitudes towards slavery and concubinage. Archival debates among administrators reveal tensions between tradition and reform, with some officials advocating gradual transformation while others defended established practices as integral to dynastic stability. These discussions marked the beginning of a transition that would reshape the experiences of women entering royal households and redefine the institutional meaning of the harem itself. The gradual transformation of royal harems during the 19th century reflected broader shifts in imperial governance, international diplomacy, and legal reform. Archival decrees from the late Ottoman, Qajar, and Mughal successor states indicate that pressure to regulate or curtail slave acquisition increasingly intersected with internal debates about modernization and administrative centralization. Historical records suggest that while harems did not disappear abruptly, their demographic composition and political significance evolved as the mechanisms that had once supplied captive women through warfare and frontier raiding became less central to state policy. Diplomatic correspondence reveals that European observers often interpreted harems through Orientalist assumptions, yet their reports also documented tangible institutional change. Surviving embassy records describe reforms restricting slave markets, encouraging manumission, and redefining palace households along more formal marital lines. These developments were uneven and frequently contested, but they contributed to a gradual decline in the integration of war captives into elite domestic structures. Chroniclers within these societies similarly noted the shifting balance between inherited custom and emerging legal frameworks influenced by global economic and political pressures. Legal codes of the period demonstrate increasing attention to the rights and status of formerly enslaved individuals. Ottoman Tanzimat reforms, for example, introduced administrative measures that indirectly affected the operation of palace households by regulating slavery and emphasizing bureaucratic uniformity. Surviving legal petitions indicate that women who had once been absorbed into harems through conquest could now pursue formal recognition of property ownership, inheritance claims, or contractual marriage arrangements. These changes did not erase structural inequality, but they expanded the range of legal identities available to women whose lives had begun within systems of captivity. The decline of territorial expansion also altered the social meaning of the harem. Historical records indicate that as imperial frontiers stabilized and warfare shifted toward different strategic priorities, the symbolic association between conquest and the replenishment of palace households weakened. Instead, royal harems increasingly reflected internal court dynamics rather than the demographic consequences of military victory. Chroniclers noted a gradual contraction in size within certain courts, accompanied by a shift toward greater emphasis on nuclear family structures and the education of royal daughters for diplomatic marriage rather than internal concubinage. Despite these transformations, the legacies of earlier centuries remained visible in architecture, endowments, and social memory. Surviving palace complexes continued to house women whose origins traced back to earlier periods of expansion, and their presence embodied the continuity of institutional tradition even as reform progressed. Charitable foundations established by former concubines persisted as active elements of urban life, funding schools, hospitals, and religious institutions. These endowments serve as material evidence of how individuals, once taken into harems, could influence public welfare long after their direct involvement in court politics had diminished. The experiences of women aging within reformed palace systems varied according to personal networks and economic resources. Pension registers and estate inventories suggest that some retained comfortable living arrangements supported by stipends and familial ties, while others encountered financial insecurity as political patronage networks dissolved. Chroniclers occasionally reference disputes over property rights, highlighting the complexities faced by individuals whose status had transitioned from captive to consort to independent household head. These disputes illuminate the intersection of personal biography and evolving legal structures during a period of institutional change.